And here we go. Welcome, everybody. We have people coming in. Welcome.
Nice, nice.
I'm just going to remind people coming in to please mute yourselves and also turn off your video to reserve bandwidth. If you could please mute yourselves, that would be terrific.
It makes sense
now. I'm just going to go through and mute people if that's okay. Please mute yourselves as you're coming in. Thank you very much. All right, welcome. Terrific. My name is Robert Diamante, and I am very pleased to welcome everybody back to Literally Alive. After a 7-month hiatus. Hopefully everybody is holding up and you've been productive and enjoying yourselves as best you can. Literally Live is brought to you by the award-winning Littoral Books, Maine's independent publisher of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction books based in Portland, Maine. Visit the website littoralbooks.com to purchase the award-winning anthology Enough, Poems of Resistance and Protest, and other titles, Balancing Act 2, Wait, Poems from the Pandemic, Leslie Moore's What Rough Beasts, we have Leslie with us tonight, and Gary Lawless's How the Stones Came to Venice. Please order directly from Littoral Books. I have put links in the chat. If they're not in there, I will put them in before the end of the show. And buy a copy or two for yourself and for some friends. I want to remind everybody that tonight's event is being recorded and will be shared on the Littoral Books website. All previous recordings can be viewed on the Literally Alive webpage. If you are joining us as a guest, as I've mentioned already, please turn off your audio and your video, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the program. You will also be able to type in your thoughts, comments, and questions at any point during the show, and additionally in the chat, and additionally there are reaction buttons at the bottom of your screen, and I encourage you to use those, please. Finally, stay tuned afterwards for some important words from Agnes Buchel. For tonight's program, Changing Lanes, Writers Who Cross into Other Media, we are joined by 3 talented writers who have been published by Literal Books: Leslie Moore, Phil Carlsen, and Nancy Romines Walters. One is a printmaker, another a musician, another who turned from visual arts to writing due to her physical circumstances. All 3 are poets, and during our talk, we'll offer a particular insight into their writing practice as well as their alternative media. First up, I would like to introduce poet and printmaker Leslie Moore, whose subjects are often animals. She is the author of What Rough Beasts, poems, prints, and the winner of the 2018 Maine Literary Award for Short Fiction. She has published, Leslie, I wanted to hold up your book, sorry.
I'll hold it up.
Thank you, okay, good. I'm trying to read and do this at the same time. She's the winner of the 2018 Maine Literary Award for Short Nonfiction. She has published poems and essays in journals, newspapers, and anthologies, including English Journal, Take Heart, The Maine Review, The Catch, Cafe Review, Balancing Act 2, Deep Water, Art Word, Wait, Poems from the Pandemic, and Third Wednesday. Her art may be found in book illustrations, private collections, and at the local color gallery in Belfast, Maine, where she lives with her husband, Tom Moore, who is also a poet, and her cockapoo, Rumi. Leslie, welcome.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited that you were able to do this. So this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm queuing up. Can everybody see the screen?
I can.
If anybody cannot see the screen, you can tell me in the chat. But Leslie, would you read a poem, please?
Yes.
And I'll flip through your artwork as you're reading.
Okay. This poem is called Bush on Fire. The red twig dogwood crackles crimson on this March morning, spirited like the snow-fed stream below. I almost overlooked the flock of birds gorging on berries in its midst, each a black masked bandit. Bohemian waxwings, Bombicilla garrulus, silk-tailed, talkative, circumpolar nomads in search of fruit. These cheeky vagabonds pay me no mind, so busy feasting, drunk on plunder. I have time to admire their lush plumage, belly to breast to crested crown, buff gray to sepia to cinnamon. The air fills with trills and my heart rings at this manifest thing, a bush, a flame with waxy wings.
I'm just going to hold on this image. I think it's so wonderful. Thank you for reading that. Leslie, when we were preparing for tonight, you said once that your art begins with encountering the wild. Tell us about a particular encounter that inspired not only a print, but a poem.
Okay, one of my poetry groups has been meeting outdoors for the past 2 years, you know why, as much as possible, of course not in the winter. And one of our favorite places to meet this past summer was on the shores of Lake St. George, which is in Liberty. Yeah. And one day, as we were talking about poems, a loon came in for a landing. And believe me, it was more thrilling than anything you may have seen on the Winter Olympics in Beijing. So of course I wrote a poem about it and eventually did a print. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's actually a loon diving, not landing. But so that was one of my animal encounters.
I love that story. Thank you. All right, next up we have Phil Carlsen, and we'll hear more from Leslie as the evening progresses. Phil Carlsen is a composer and cellist who taught music for 33 years at the University of Maine at Farmington. He has received commissions and performances from many groups across the country, including the Manhattan Marimba Quartet, Sebago Long Lakes Region Chamber Music Festival, Portland Symphony Orchestra, National Symphony Orchestra Chamber Players, and the Basov Ballet Theater. His poems have appeared in Off the Coast, the Ekphrastic Review, the Tower Journal, the Deepwater series in the Maine Sunday Telegram, and elsewhere. He lives in South Portland with his wife, the poet Jerry Terriel. I'd like to play, welcome Phil. I'd like to play an excerpt from a piece of yours titled That Music. While I'm queuing that up, would you tell us a little bit about what we're gonna see?
Sure. This is a piece that I wrote back in 2000, I think. It's for chorus, 2 pianos, and 2 percussionists. And the text that I used is by Lee Sharkey. Lee actually came to me with a poem and said she thought that it would work well as a piece for a musical setting. And I agreed. And so I made a setting of the piece. And so this is a recording. Let me just read the poem quickly before we play it. This is a section that goes like this. That music you played each night to resolution and traveled on in braided streams that distanced, neared, and distanced. That music you fell to, bowing all the senses. Still it needs you, still it does.
Oh, that's wonderful. Can everybody see the screen?
I can, yeah.
There we go. Oh, that gave me chills. Welcome. So tell us how music pushed you towards poetry.
Well, I think the thing that pulled me into poetry the most early on was as a young composer, undergraduate, wanting to write music for voices and looking for poetry that I could use for musical settings. I don't think I've ever really had an interest in setting my own words to music, but feeling very much part of the classical tradition where composers would take the work of other poets and use it in their writing. So that interest in finding texts that would work well for music led me to start exploring poetry, wanting to find out more about how it was put together, and writing some poetry on my own. And eventually I took a class with Wes McNair, basically to try to understand poetry better, but of course we were writing poetry in that class, and I learned a lot from him. And ever since, poetry has been something that I've wanted to do just for itself, and of course continued reading poetry.
We'll look forward to asking you more about that as we progress through the evening. But
Okay.
Would you read your sonnet, Don Quixote?
Oh, sure. Let's see. This is called Strauss's Don Quixote, Portland Symphony, May 20th, 2014. I'm going to switch glasses here.
I'm going to mute some myself.
This is actually about a concert when my dad was sitting next to me. He had come out with my brother and his wife for a visit. My mom had died just the year before. So these kinds of family things are part of the poem as well. I am a cellist, and as you may know, some of you, Don Quixote has a huge cello solo in it, and the cellist represents Don Quixote. And so the music, in a sense, is telling that story. So those are the things to keep in mind. Strauss's Don Quixote. The cellist's fingers slide along the string, not touching any note from low to high, not A, B flat, C sharp. A vaguer thing than pitch, that slipping sound, more like a sigh exhaled through thin, parched lips, or midnight moth against a window screen, accompanied by swishing murmurs of tuxedo cloth across the wood with every swaying beat. I cannot hear these sounds high on the ridge of steep-sloped second balcony's last row, yet feel my own bow by that distant bridge fall slowly, slowly past his knee, as though to mark the end of Don Quixote's quest and mime the stilling of my mother's breath.
I'm going to breathe on that for a moment. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Nancy Romines Walters is a disabled poet and visual artist who lives in the foothills of Wilton, Maine. Her poetry has appeared most recently in Art World 2021, Ekphrasis at the Portland Museum of Art. Her written work can also be found in Enough, Poems of Resistance and Protest by Littoral Books, the Frost Meadow Review, Balancing Act 2, also by Littoral Books, an anthology of poems by 50 Maine women, and the American Journal of Nursing, among others. Her visual work has been widely exhibited in Maine and internationally. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you for showing up. You and I talked about doing this, what it feels like 200 years ago, but it was about 6 months ago when we started this.
It does indeed seem like a long time ago.
Well, thank you for being patient and showing up. And I would hope that you would read a poem while I show your work.
Okay.
Would you like to say a little bit about your work beforehand, or do you want to wait until after?
I'll wait till after to talk about the work. The poem I'm going to read is from Balancing Act 2, and it's called The Cure. My mind rolls with the wonder of words and words within words, the crackle of them discovered like ropes of wild electric lines as other ways of noticing grow duller or erased. Did you see that? No. Where? Did you hear that? No. What? How did it go? I don't remember. But written words are safe and can be returned to, adjusted, arranged, taken time with, are quiet or not when I say so. I control the words I write. I set the pace and I think as long as I want or need. I rinse and repeat with no need for excuse or explanation. Paper scraps stay with me to capture the cure in curiosity and the bat in batteries. I am afraid to love it so much, certain the love will work as a beacon to freeze this ability for stealing by my merciless poacher next and last.
I'm sorry about that, Nancy.
That's okay.
Thank you for reading that. Nancy, when we were preparing several months ago and just recently, you and I, we talked a lot. And you said something I think is really worth noting, and that is, quote, poetry is the perfect form because the process inherent in poetry is the perfect fit for someone learning with a new brain. For those who do not know your story, would you tell us what you mean?
Well, I'll say this. The most important thing for me in any media is a dialogue with another, a viewer, a reader, the other half of the conversation with my work. Some of the main themes in my visual work are the idea of families that we create, belonging or not, and the connections between us that continue on beyond our comprehension. My visual art is very labor intensive. The multimedia installation.
Uh-oh. Did we lose Nancy? Nancy was saying that she might lose power because there's a windstorm in Wilton.
Yeah.
So,
and it's pretty bad here, so I would say that's what happened.
okay. So Phil and Leslie, I'm going to posit the question then that I want to wait till Nancy comes back. I had a question. There was something that came up when we were chatting on Sunday about how her work had a very Leslie, I think you brought it up. It was like it felt very much like the synapses of the brain. Let's wait to see if we can get Nancy back before we start talking about that. But I'll put the question out to you too, and then we can go from there. Now that we've shared a bit about your stories, I will throw out the question that I'm very interested in, and that what are the similes and metaphors of working across media? How does your writing and your visual art or your musical art, how do they compare or contrast? What are the similes? What are the metaphors? What are the contrasts? How are they alike? How are they not alike? Phil, would you like to start, or Leslie? Phil, go ahead.
Well, I realize, especially as a result of our conversations, how much writing music and writing poetry for me is like solving puzzles. And especially if I'm working in formal poetry, where I'm let's say, restricted to a certain line length, or trying to work in rhymes, or working in a form such as sestina or sonnet. The puzzle there is to how to make a poem that works as a poem, even while it's put into this structure, a kind of preconceived structure. And there's something similar that happens in music, where several instruments are put together at the same time, and you have to sort of figure out the relationships between those instruments and how to make them work together to maintain their independence, but also join in partnership. And that creates another kind of puzzle to solve, and one that also has to do with structure. So I think that those things are always fascinating to me, and things that pull me in to both medium. I can't hear you, Robert.
You've talked a lot about structure during our preliminary conversations, and I want to get back to that and have you read something that exemplifies that. But Leslie, I want to move on to a question about your working process. We had a really nice conversation, and I had asked you about the relationship between your printmaking and writing poetry, and like which comes first. Does the poem come first? Does the sketch come first? Do you sketch a poem like you might sketch out a print before you make a block print? Tell us a little bit about your process, how they compare or contrast.
Okay. Well, let me tell you a little bit about my printmaking process first. I do the reduction method, which means I use one block, a linoleum block, and I carve a little bit from the block and print one color, then carve a little bit more from the same block and print another color, and layer color on color on color. And by the end of the print run, there's almost nothing left of the block at all, except for the thin black lines that define the figures in the block. And in my case, it's mostly fur and feathers and fins and maybe some tree bark. So Japanese printmakers call that the key block. And you really don't know what the print's going to look like until you get to the end and you print the key block. So it kind of unlocks the door, unlocks the magic of the print. And I think that could be a metaphor for writing poetry.
I'm not trying to force a metaphor. I'm just like wondering if there
I know, but you know, you scratch out a rough draft and then you start carving away at it in a poem. The revision part is taking things out, revising, and I'm looking for meaning in the layers of the poem, and often with a poem, I don't know what I'm trying to say until I find that key block that opens up the secret of the poem. So I think there's similarities in that way. Usually the poem comes.
Oh, Leslie, you accidentally got muted. Can you unmute? And by the way, we have Nancy Walters back. Go ahead and finish. Sorry, Leslie.
I'd say the poem usually comes first, just because I have to produce a poem a week for poetry groups that I'm involved with. So, and then the print takes longer, more days to complete. So, yeah.
When you're like doing your reduction method, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about words? Are you thinking about your encounter with the wild? We started off with your encounter with the wild.
Mm-hmm.
Are you thinking about that encounter, or are you just focused on the process?
Well, there are a lot of steps in printmaking, a lot of time where I'm using my hands, and which allows my mind to range free. And so I think all sorts of thoughts go on while I'm preparing the paper and carving the linoleum and inking the block. It allows me to think, and often even though I've written the poem first and done the print second, I'll go back to the poem because of ideas I get.
We have Nancy back. Nancy, you can unmute yourself. You can tell us all about the windstorm. But there was
Holy
something really,
cow.
was it really, you guys are really encountering a lot of wind up there. There was
I
something really
guess.
wonderful that Leslie said when we were going through your portfolio, and I'm certainly happy to share your images again. But Leslie, would you share that insight, and then maybe you and Nancy can talk a little bit about.
Well, you know, Nancy didn't really get to finish her story. She only got to the first half, so maybe you should finish your story first.
That sounds good.
All right. Telemarketer. Okay. It's been one thing after another. Okay. If I can finish the story, is
Please
that
do.
the idea? Okay. So the most important thing for me in any media, as I was saying, is a dialogue with another, a viewer, a reader, the other half of the conversation, whichever kind of work I'm doing. Some of the main themes in my visual work are the idea of families that we create, belonging or not, and the interconnections between us that continue beyond our comprehension. My visual art is very labor intensive. I make wall-based multimedia installations and use a wide variety of materials, as well as using traditional utilitarian women's crafts, which I was taught as a young child, creating work that satisfies me and my deeply ingrained Protestant work ethic. The more I stitched, the more interested I became in using knots and snarls as metaphors for states of individuality and unity, connection and tension. And I made intricate works on paper and in soapstones, depicting the knots as a counterpoint to the stitches. Natural forms also suggest human traits, singular, but always part of a whole. I also work with the ephemeral qualities of shadows, representing the fleeting impressions of life experiences. I was very active and was the consummate part-time multitasker, as I referred to myself often in job interviews, working as a designer and in numerous libraries, both in New York and in Maine, and in addition, from a young age as a caregiver. I lived in New York City from '81 to 2001. When I returned, I became an RN and continued to show my artwork here in Maine. As a nurse, I was published in the American Journal of Nursing, but I still didn't think of myself as a writer. And at the same time, I was misdiagnosed for several years of having migraines with auras, which were becoming debilitating. In 2013, an acupuncturist was the one who told me that she didn't think I had migraines and that I needed an MRI. And she was right. I was diagnosed with a large brain tumor, which was taking up basically the back right-hand side of my head at that point, affecting both my occipital and parietal lobes. The craniotomy removed most of the tumor, and then my brain was irradiated. The tumor, combined with the various treatments and medications, left me unable to drive, to judge space, to multitask, do any kind of math, or walk without a cane. I have seizures, no sight on my left visual peripheral field, and issues with balance and fatigue and memory. So what used to be automatic now takes deliberate effort and serial steps and conscious will. So I'm very slow. It took a lot of time to grieve the loss of so many self-defining skills that were important to me before. and then to figure out how to move forward with what felt like and will always feel to some extent like a totally new brain and body. Friends brought poetry books, and several suggested that I try writing poetry because it seemed like a perfect fit, and it was, working in short spurts when I had the most energy and was most alert, sitting down, which was much less fatiguing than being in front of a big wall, with no need for remembering plot. And even the most seasoned poets made many drafts and many mistakes, and that was okay. I was off the hook. No need to have my handwriting be legible to anyone but me. And I didn't need to have any fine motor skills or long hours on my feet. And I didn't need to stay awake on a particular clock. Luckily, this all happened before COVID, and with friends' help, I started a poetry group in Wilton, which cheered me on. And at first I used poetry to describe how I was experiencing the world with this new way of looking. And it was also a part of grieving. I began to make new connections with poets in groups such as through the MWPA, and also with others with memory and neurological disorders, such as the Brain Tumor Support Group at Maine Med. And both of these groups are invaluable to me. When Littoral books included my work in Balancing Act 2, it was an especially pivotal and magical moment. I felt like I was able with these poems to speak for neurologically disabled communities. When my neuro-oncologist read that work, she said, "Now I understand."
That is horrible, a horrible place to stop. We have to get Nancy back to finish this story. When Nancy and I were talking, she told me a little bit about this, and I really want her to finish in her own words, but it's a remarkable story of how she used her writing to express the concerns that she had as a visual artist, but also to help people understand what she was experiencing after her brain trauma. So I am going to wait for Nancy to get back, and hopefully we can get back to that. In the meantime, Phil, would you like to talk a little bit? Let's move from that to structure. And would you like to talk a little bit about structure and then share the poem that you would like to read, which I believe is entitled a Chinganeth, which is a Welsh word? You can maybe explain that a little bit better.
All right. Well, why don't I just read that poem? It's a Chinganeth, and my pronunciation may be wrong as well, but it's a Welsh form that basically the rules are that lines are in two parts, and each part has the same sequence of consonants, but the vowels change. So, and in my poem, for example, I have the word across followed by a crass. And there are other places where I basically use that kind of structure in putting the poem together.
Would you like me to share it visually? I actually have it.
Yes.
Would you like me to? Okay.
Sure, that'd be great. So the another term for this Welsh procedure is chiming or harmonies. And of course that would kind of naturally draw a musician in. Rather than putting the two to the pairs of images on the same line, I made them into couplets. So each of these couplets that you see here has essentially the same consonants in each line, but changed vowels. And this is about a poem after a painting that probably everybody knows. It's a famous Bruegel painting of Icarus splashing into the water in the middle of this huge landscape, and he's pretty much unnoticed by everybody else. So here's the poem. Yes?
I'm wondering if it could be enlarged. Is that possible so I could read it better? No?
No.
Okay.
Goneth after Bruegel. Icarus carouses across a crass, indifferent sky, and if he rants, cries, stunned bird molting, sunburnt, melting, whiskered fathers, wax and feathers. Noon nears, no one hears. The brig, all rigged in Bruegel's ragged world, where old flotsam, birds, flies in amber, plowmen's horses, plums and houses, far red, furrowed fields, folds of natal sea, have naught to say. And that's it. Robert, you're muted right now.
Yeah, I'm pushing buttons left and right here. Sorry. Leslie, would you like to share a thought about that, or a thought about the way you structure your poems in contrast to Phil?
I love that painting, and your poem goes with it so well. I'll have to get a copy of that poem to look more carefully, and the way the words pair up with each other. I'll read a poem about my two processes of printmaking and writing poetry. This is in the beginning of my book. It's called Dichotomy. I don't have a poem today, but I've got the first blush of color on two relief prints: a woodpecker's fiery cap, a grosbeak's gold feathering, and the clear imperative to carve and ink and print one color on top of another, blues and browns, a gradation of grays, and finally, the black key block that will define all. Instead of putting one bulky word after the other, I'm in my studio, sharpening tools, carving rough bark into a tree, mixing just the right yellow to flame a bird's brow, rolling out sky that darkens towards the horizon, anticipating the denouement when loose strands come together and my birds resolve without a word.
That's sort of like an Ars Poetica, except maybe you'd call it an Ars Artica or something. But
I love your poem, by the way, Ars Covidica. It was right next to mine in Wait.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Pandemic book.
Right.
Losing your poetry license.
I love that idea of the print sort of emerging as the block sort of diminishes, and then you get to the key block. That's so poetic in itself.
I like that. I like the way you put that.
Almost like one getting bigger and one getting smaller at the same time.
Right.
Leslie, I'm hoping we can get Nancy back. I'm glad that she had the opportunity to tell us more of the story. I really, in anticipation of her coming back, we can flesh this out more, but I really wanted you to share your observation about her work, and I'm happy to flash through the work again. But your observation about how the pieces felt neurological.
Yeah, I thought there were a lot of connections being made in her pieces, and it looked to me like the neural pathways in a brain. And it was interesting that she created all that artwork before she ever discovered she had the brain tumor. So it was almost as if her brain was going in that direction.
I thought the same thing when I was looking at this.
Look at the little lines connecting the different parts of the brain.
There were some other pieces like these.
This one, yeah.
And her use of shadows is so great.
I hope she appears again, because we had such a wonderful conversation about her work. I actually remember seeing her work at CMCA years ago, before I even knew who she was, and how her concerns as an artist, a visual artist, how she had to translate that into poetry, and then of course having had a traumatic brain trauma, how finding words to express these concepts were a sort of a form of therapy for her. I truly wish she would come back and be able to talk about that. For sure. And they do have that quality of neurons and synapses and connections. And a little bit of fancy. It's very fanciful or whimsical to some extent.
Yeah, I loved her metaphor about knots and how they represent more than just a tangle of threads.
I'm trying to get to that work. Yeah, it's almost like a crochet, but I look at this and I feel like a web work of cells, a pattern of cells,
Right.
And the membranes that connect the connective tissue and so forth. It's very interesting. It's almost like she was working out subconsciously, like you said, Leslie. Something subconscious was going on with her work, and then her body maybe was sort of, her artistic sensibility was channeling something in a really kind of interesting metaphysical way. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to open up questions for the public. If anybody has questions. Oh, Dawn Nye has a question. Leslie, do you cut linoleum or wood?
I mostly do linoleum these days. I started out with wood, but linoleum is a little bit easier on my hands.
And people can see your work at your gallery in Belfast. Is it right in town Belfast?
It is right downtown Belfast.
And you studied art before? No, you studied English, right? Before you became an artist? What's that?
Right. I was an English teacher for 25 years, and really, when I slipped out of the English classroom, that's when I began focusing full-time on my art. And then I slipped back into poetry. I think because of the influence of my husband.
And Phil, you're married to a poet. Do you two share poems with one another?
We do, and when I was thinking about topics for conversation here, Leslie, I was thinking about you also being married to a poet. And it's great. It's like we have our household poetry group here, and Jerry is the one who's working much more on poetry these days than I am, but I get to hear her drafts, and it's really wonderful. And Leslie, you probably have something similar in your house. Do you share quite a bit? Yeah.
It's back and forth all the time.
Yeah.
I have a question from Gillian. Was there a time when you feared, and this is for both, was it when you feared you couldn't possibly develop deep skills in more than one medium? Did the second medium you picked up have a greater feeling of play? And if so, is there still a differential in the seriousness? Does that That's an interesting question.
That's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Mm.
I would have to say that I've always been much more committed to composition than to poetry. And maybe in a sense that gives me freedom with poetry to really do whatever, because that is not my main medium of expression.
So when you were studying music, you never really thought, I'm gonna write poetry one day. And I mean, this is a ridiculous question, but you really weren't on that track. You weren't,
No,
you
not
had
at
a
all.
written poem casually even at that point.
That's right.
Yeah.
I had written poetry from time to time, and but I had never thought of that as something that I would take on as a career. I've always loved writing, and I've probably thought at some point, oh, it'd be great to be a writer. I think I was probably maybe more interested in art than in poetry, and architecture was a big interest early on. But
And hence your love of structure with architecture, right?
right, that's true. Yeah, yeah.
Leslie, do you ever sort of fight between mediums? This is from Jefferson Novicki. I love the poems in your book where there is tension between making art or making a poem. And that sort of plays into the previous question, if you want to sort of.
Right, right. Well, maybe I should read one of those poems. Often I'm going to one of my poetry groups and I don't have a poem because I've been playing in my studio. So this is an excuse poem. It's called "On Presenting to My Poetry Group the Barn Owl Lino Cut I Finished This Week instead of writing a poem." You know, you can see it now, but there's the print.
That's one of my favorite prints of yours, by the way.
Thank you. Surely they'll admire the structure of the print, the key block that shapes the composition, zigzags the branch, radiates needles, sets the owl aloft. I've titled it Barn Owl Nocturne. They may feel a rhythm in spilling pine, sense meter in wing beat, catch their breath at the tonality of moon glow. The colors, Japanese, juxtaposed as they are, should add resonance. White moon, blue night, green pine, gray feather, especially the red chop. Flexed talons suggest the owl's prey. I hope they note the symbolism, omen from the spirit world. It's all about death, isn't it?
Wow. I have something from Linda, and this is for Phil. Linda Buckmaster, I'm assuming, from Phil. Did the poem have those reading lines, or is that part of the composing process that should be repeating lines? I'm not sure. Linda, do you want to unmute and maybe ask that better than I'm reading it?
I would assume that's a question about the music that you played earlier, Robert.
Sure.
Yes, I have to say, it's hard for me to write in chat while I'm trying to listen too. So, yeah, I noticed that there were the repetitions of the lines of the poem, and this is always a curious thing to me about how a poem is set to music. What kinds of liberties, I'll just use that word, but not in a negative way.
Yeah.
Or was that already the structure of the poem, or what is that process? I always find that really interesting.
Right. There's a long tradition when poetry is set to music of altering the poem by doing repetitions of lines. Certainly in singing a line, syllables will be stretched out, and so the rhythm gets transformed.
Right.
And with this particular poem of Lee's, and it's often the case, the length of the text is such that it might take you 20 seconds to read it, but that's not enough for a piece of music. And so I think you accomplish a couple things by repeating words. For one thing, it gives the listener a better chance to hear it again, because it's not always easy to understand the words that are being sung. And the other thing is, of course, that it allows you to create a larger composition and to maybe take a section of the poem and sort of zero in on it and really give yourself a chance to really contemplate what the meaning of the words is and use the music to provide a kind of commentary on it. And you think about, let's say, settings of the Catholic Mass that have been done, you know, over the centuries, and you have the words Kyrie eleison, and that might go on for 10 minutes in a composition.
Right,
And,
right.
I think of Palestrina or somebody like that, where it's like,
exactly
it's
right.
mesmerizing and beautiful and it's meditative.
Yeah. So, you know, in a sense, it's trying to get the same kind of feeling with a poem, a secular poem. So.
Should we go back to some of your music, and do you want to play a little example of that? Linda, did you want to see a little bit more of that?
Oh, that would be lovely. I really, this is something, I mean, I don't at all have a musical background. I have a dance background, but
Well, go ahead and share that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Okay, let me get to that, and then I'm going to go ahead and mute you there, and then I'm going to go ahead and share, if I can find your video. I don't think I've gotten it. Sorry about that. I wasn't prepared to cue it up again, but let me just give me one more chance.
Well, I'll just say while you're getting that, Robert.
Yeah,
that,
please.
For example, the first words are "that music." That was a line by itself in Lee's poem, and she does use the words "that music" one more time. But I just took the rhythm of that and wanted to stretch it out. For one thing, take the second syllable, "that music," and make something musical out of it by changing its rhythm.
Where would you like to start, Phil?
You know, I wonder if we should just start at the beginning, Robert, and do the same thing. There's another line that comes up here where she has a line that says "that distanced, neared, and distanced."
And feel free to talk over it, okay?
Okay. I'll just say that the word "distant" and "neared" is that kind of dichotomy, and I used a change of instruments and a change of voices to go back and forth between those two words. So one group of voices would sing "distanced" with one pair of instruments, and the other group would respond with "neared" with another group of instruments. So I think you might see those things. We could just listen to it here, Robert, and then.
Yep. And then I want to make sure to give Leslie a little bit more time before the end. We're running up at the end.
Instruments as well, as if the singers are percussion instruments along with the percussion players, going nama 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 and baro 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 baro. We could keep going, Robert. So altos and tenors sing "that distance," and they're singing along with the piano two and the marimba, and then the sopranos sing "neared" along with piano one and the vibraphone. Go ahead.
Did you want to continue, Phil?
We don't need to continue. I don't want to use up too much time here.
Yeah, we're running up towards the end here.
Yeah.
We could do a whole show just on music. I could do a whole show with each one of you. And I have a feeling we're going to be inviting Nancy back to have her share more of her story.
Oh, I want to hear the rest of her story.
Yeah. I spent 2 hours on the phone with her one day, just chatting. She and I can really talk. And Leslie, you and I had a great chat too. So I want to give you another opportunity to read and talk a little bit more about your relationship with animals. What's a cockapoo? Is that a dog or is that a bird? It's a bird.
It's a cocker and a poodle.
Okay,
He likes zooming.
gotcha. I was thinking of a cockatiel.
Right. I was thinking about Phil's poem Don Quixote and how much he was describing sound and music, and which I try to do sometimes. So I thought maybe to finish, I'd read one more poem about trying to describe a gray catbird song. It's called Gray Catbird. Instead of the sturm and drang of the neighbor's lawnmower, we hear the aria of a catbird perched atop the thorny thicket and vine tangle that borders our garden plot. We listen to him riff, trill, and titter, ripple, and rill. He's as unadorned as a monk in black cap and gray garb, but there's nothing austere about his song. We soar on the wings of his wild psalm.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
I love those musical references in there, just practically every line. And Dressed Like a Monk makes me think of Thelonious Monk. And so it was a delightful poem.
Thank you.
I think Agnes Buchel is here, but I do have somebody, let's see, I'm a friend of Nancy's from our brain tumor group. I'm a poet. Okay, this is from a Jennifer Bonner. I'm an interloper, friend of Nancy's from our brain tumor group. I'm a poet who has moved from the workaday world. Nature is my source of material. Okay, she wants to share pieces. Actually, this calls in my desire to bring on Agnes Buchel because we're going to talk about our next show. Agnes, if you're there, I will unmute you. Or unmute yourself if you could.
Hello?
There she is. Agnes Buchel, editor and author, Littoral Books.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Good, I'm glad. Hi, everybody. Great to have you all here. Great to be here. Yeah, so we're going to be doing some other shows, Robert. Correct?
Correct. Next month, actually, Leslie will be back. You'll hear more wonderful poetry from Leslie. And we're going to invite Gary Lawless to read from his book, also published recently, since we haven't been able to have live readings. And those are the two most recent books that you're publishing. Is that right?
As of today.
Have published, rather?
Yes. Yeah. So, and
And surprise, surprise, Leslie, you might not know this, but we're going to ask you to invite two poets to read with you. Is that right, Agnes?
that's right, Robert.
All right. Would you like to say anything else? Thank you, good people, for coming.
I would like to thank everyone for coming, and I would love to thank the poets, Phil, Leslie, and Nancy. It's just been such an honor to publish you guys and to have you be part of Littoral Books and to see your books fly out of the boxes and off the shelves. And all of the people who are here tonight, thank you for supporting Littoral Books. It's really important to us that you're here and that you love the poems that we love and the writers that we love. And thank you, Robert. This was wonderful. You were fantastic, as always.
So thank you. A lot of buttons tonight, a lot of buttons to push, but I've been thrilled to host this. We've been wanting to do a show like this for a while. I'm always fascinated to hear other artists' stories as somebody that writes but also works in other media. It's always interesting to hear how things happen for other artists. And sometimes things overlap and sometimes they simply don't. So it's been really interesting to hear that. And it's also interesting to hear your inspiration. So with that said, if there are no more questions, I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you very much. And I've asked Nancy she has written out more of her story, and I'll coordinate with Agnes, and maybe there's a place that we can put it on the website so that you can at least read a little bit more about Nancy's experience, because it's fascinating and interesting, and she's very articulate. So thank you all for coming. If there are no more questions, have a great night, and thank you for joining.
Thank
Literally.
you, Robert.
Good night,
Thank you,
everyone.
Robert.
Leslie, thank you. Phil, thank you. Good night.
Pleasure.
Thank
Yeah,
you all
good
for
night.
coming.
Good night.
I'm going to stick around till everyone goes. Sweep up the
I
stage.
want to stay and read the chats.
Yeah, why don't I have plenty of time, Leslie and Phil, if you'd like
I
to
should
read
about-
the comments.
Yeah.
Read the chat.
Oh, just a minute. Okay. I'm not sure I know how to get out of here. Okay, I do. Thank you, Robert and Phil, and I'm so sorry that Nancy got cut off.
Yeah.
Hers is the compelling story.
It really wasn't. It was like right at that time that it was
Mm.
just like right at that moment. So
That's right.
I'm going to try to give her a call, and I'm sure that she's very sad about this, but maybe we can have her back or something like that.
That would be good.
Yeah.
And Jennifer, if you see her, let her know that we missed her. I know you're a friend of hers, and in the future we'll have an open poetry night, and you'll be able to maybe share your poems then. All right?
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
all.
everybody. Thank you.
Good night.